Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, grab your coffee, and discover that your entire career, everything you've built, has been wiped out. Not by a natural disaster, not by war, but by a single signature on a piece of paper thousands of miles away. This isn't fiction. This actually happened to millions of workers worldwide when America launched what economists are calling the most devastating trade war in modern history. What started as a promise to bring jobs back to America instead triggered the largest economic exodus since World War II. 7 nations, economic powerhouses controlling trillions in global trade, didn't just walk away from the United States. They ran, and they all ran to the same place, Canada. This is the untold story of how America's tariff gamble backfired so spectacularly that it reshaped the entire global economy in just 4 months. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this moment might mark the beginning of the end of American economic dominance. Let's rewind to early 2025. The promises were bold. The rhetoric was fierce. America was going to reclaim its manufacturing glory through the power of tariffs. Taxes on foreign goods designed to make American products more competitive. The plan seemed simple. Make foreign goods so expensive that companies would have no choice but to buy American. But here's what politicians don't tell you about tariffs. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're economic weapons. And when you fire economic weapons at your trading partners, you better be prepared for them to fire back. The first shot came without warning. Sweeping tariffs, some as brutal as 35%, slammed into America's closest allies. Industries that had spent decades building intricate supply chains suddenly found themselves locked out of the world's largest market. But instead of collapsing, something extraordinary happened. These nations didn't beg for mercy. They didn't negotiate. They adapted. And they found a new partner who welcomed them with open arms: Canada. The German Exodus. Our story begins in the heart of Germany's industrial might, the automotive corridors of Munich and Wolfsburg. These aren't just cities, they're the beating heart of European engineering excellence. For generations, German automakers had perfected a delicate dance with American manufacturers, shipping precision-crafted components across the Atlantic. Then came February 14, 2025, a 25% tariff on all automotive parts entering the United States. Overnight, carefully orchestrated logistics networks that had taken decades to build simply stopped. At summer GmbH, a company that had employed 2,500 skilled workers for over 50 years. The silence was deafening. Orders from Detroit, orders that had sustained entire communities, vanished. Forklifts that had never stopped moving suddenly sat idle. Assembly lines that had hummed with Germanic precision went quiet. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Germany didn't panic. They pivoted. Within hours of the tariff announcement, German trade ministers were on flights to Ottawa. By Valentine's Day, February 14, they had signed a supplemental trade protocol with Canada worth $10 billion annually. It wasn't just a trade deal, it was a complete rerouting of industrial destiny. Transmission casings that had been destined for Michigan assembly plants were suddenly bound for Ontario. In less than 3 weeks, 70% of January's inventory was redirected northward. GM Canada's Oshawa plant, which had been running at reduced capacity, suddenly fired up additional production lines. 350 workers who had been facing uncertain futures were rehired overnight. The irony was almost poetic. While GM was laying off over 300 employees in Michigan, their Canadian operations were expanding. German engineers worked around the clock, recoding entire enterprise systems, relabeling shipments from Detroit to Toronto, from Flint to London, Ontario. Hamilton's logistics sector exploded with activity, adding 200 warehouse jobs almost overnight to manage the flood of redirected components. What had started as an economic crisis had become an economic opportunity, but for Canada, not America. The wind power revolution. The German pivot was just the beginning. In March, Intercon, a Franco-German wind energy giant, made a move that sent shockwaves through the renewable energy sector. They signed a $1.1 billion deal to ship wind turbine components directly to Canada's expanding clean energy infrastructure. Quebec's assembly yards, once quiet, began filling with components stamped, "Made in Germany." Workers in Ontario found themselves loading trucks with German wind modules, shipping them to installation sites across the country. Bavarian technicians ran new simulations, designed new supply chains, and rewrote contracts that had previously pointed south. By April, what had begun as a disaster had evolved into a comprehensive strategy. Europe wasn't just surviving America's trade war. They were thriving by completely reimagining their North American partnerships. Denmark's Green Gambit. The Danish story is perhaps the most dramatic of all. In Esbjerg, the coastal wind capital of Scandinavia, turbine blades, some as long as commercial jetliners, sat motionless in warehouses. A crushing 30% American tariff had cancelled orders worth hundreds of millions overnight. Factory managers who had never experienced a work stoppage were suddenly preparing for furloughs. Crews that had worked steadily for decades faced unemployment. The future of Danish renewable energy exports looked bleak. But Denmark didn't surrender. They redirected their entire renewable energy export strategy toward Canada. By April 1, a green technology pact worth $1.5 billion was finalized, the largest clean energy deal in Canadian history. The transformation was breathtaking. Turbine blades originally destined for Arizona wind farms were rerouted to Nova Scotia. Solar modules meant for Florida's sunshine were instead shipped to Saskatchewan's prairies. Within weeks, 150 Danish engineers had relocated to Halifax and Regina, bringing decades of expertise in renewable energy installation. Nova Scotia's industrial sector experienced a renaissance. 200 local workers received intensive training in Danish turbine technology. Saskatchewan's logistics centers doubled their shifts to accommodate the influx of equipment. Back in Denmark, CNC machines were reprogrammed for Canadian electrical grid specifications. The numbers tell the story. Wind turbine exports to Canada jumped 65% in a single month. Denmark retained 900 jobs that would have been lost. Canada gained 1,100 new positions in the clean energy sector. The pivot wasn't just economic, it was revolutionary. The battery wars. Half a world away, South Korea faced its own crisis. The silence inside Samsung and LG Chem's battery gigafactories was deafening. These weren't just manufacturing facilities, they were temples to technological precision, producing the lithium-ion batteries that power everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. A 20% American tariff had severed their connections to California's tech sector overnight. Pallets of battery modules, each worth thousands of dollars, sat motionless in warehouses. Managers stared at spreadsheets bleeding red ink, watching years of carefully built relationships evaporate. But Seoul didn't hesitate. On March 20th, LG Chem and Samsung SDI announced a $1.7 billion partnership with Northvolt Canada, the country's emerging battery manufacturing champion. 500,000 battery modules were reassigned from American destinations to Canadian facilities in Windsor, London, and Hamilton. The logistics were staggering. Packing crews worked double shifts, replacing shipping labels that once read Los Angeles with Ontario. By mid-May, 2 Canadian facilities had each added 350 technicians specifically trained in Korean battery assembly protocols. The human impact was profound. In South Korea, 3,000 jobs that had been hanging in the balance were secured. Production lines in Ulsan kept running. But the real victory was strategic. The global electric vehicle supply chain, once dependent on American integration, was now flowing directly through Canada. France's hydrogen pivot. In Lyon, France, the crisis hit the hydrogen sector with devastating force. At facilities producing electrolyzers, sophisticated machines that convert water into clean hydrogen fuel, orders had simply vanished. A 30% American tariff had eliminated hundreds of millions in contracts overnight. The French response was swift and comprehensive. By April 3, France had negotiated a $1.2 billion hydrogen infrastructure agreement with Canada. $800 million in electrolyzer equipment was redirected to Quebec and Ontario. Simultaneously, a Parisian turbine manufacturer committed $400 million in wind systems to a massive Nova Scotia coastal project. The human element of this transformation was remarkable. 250 French engineers relocated to Montreal and Toronto, bringing decades of expertise in hydrogen technology. Factory acceptance tests were conducted in collaboration with Canadian energy firms, creating a new model for international technical cooperation. 180 Canadian workers enrolled in accelerated programs at the Université de Montréal, mastering French energy assembly protocols. The partnership preserved 1,000 French jobs while creating 850 new positions in Canada. However, the transition wasn't without casualties. In Lyon, some welding stations went dark. One supplier was forced to lay off 150 workers after shifting production to meet Canadian specifications. The new economic order rewarded agility and punished inflexibility. Australia's mineral exodus. Australia's story unfolded across the red deserts of the Pilbara region, where iron ore trains had screamed toward coastal ports for decades, feeding America's steel industry. Then came the 30% tariff on raw minerals, and those trains suddenly had nowhere to go. Shipments stalled. Mines that had operated continuously for generations went quiet. The economic impact threatened to devastate entire communities built around mineral extraction. But Australia was already drafting its response. By April 20, the Northern Stars Initiative was signed, a $3.5 billion minerals pact with Canada that completely redirected the flow of Australian resources. Trains that had traditionally dumped ore into ships bound for California were rerouted toward Vancouver and Thunder Bay. Canadian ports added 400 workers to handle the increased volume. Ontario steel mills upgraded their blast furnaces to process higher-grade Australian ore, boosting output by 18% by mid-year. Australia's lithium sector followed the same pattern. A joint venture with a Canadian electric bus manufacturer rerouted battery-grade lithium carbonate to Welland, Ontario. 2,100 Australian mining jobs were preserved, though smaller contractors did face cuts. The message was clear. Even the most basic commodities, iron ore, lithium, coal, could be rerouted, repackaged, and reforged into new international partnerships when traditional relationships became untenable. Mexico's northern pivot. Perhaps no country felt the sting of American tariffs more acutely than Mexico. A crushing 35% tariff on automotive components threatened to sever supply chains that had been the backbone of North American manufacturing integration for decades. Plants in Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, and Monterrey, cities that had built their entire economies around serving American assembly lines, faced potential collapse. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of jobs hung in the balance. But Mexico's response was both swift and strategic. Within weeks, Mexico and Canada announced the Triple North Corridor Alliance, worth $8.2 billion in redirected automotive parts trade. Suspension systems, electronic control units, and wiring harnesses were rerouted from American destinations to Canadian facilities. Ontario's automotive sector experienced explosive growth. Brampton's logistics hubs expanded rapidly. Windsor's factories ran night shifts to accommodate the influx of Mexican components. Mexican suppliers avoided collapse by pivoting northward, while packing centers in Baja California maintained their workforce by redirecting volume to Canada. By May, bilateral investment between Mexico and Canada exceeded $20 billion. The attempt to isolate Mexico had, in practice, deepened its trade relationship with Canada and demonstrated that weaponized tariffs don't break partnerships, they redirect them. Brazil's agricultural revolution. The final chapter of this global exodus unfolded in Brazil's vast agricultural heartland. On March 1st, ranchers in Mato Grosso received devastating news. A 25% tariff had eliminated their access to American markets overnight. Beef, soybeans, and ethanol worth billions of dollars had nowhere to go. The fear was immediate and profound. Industry projections suggested a 30% revenue collapse. Mass layoffs seemed inevitable. Entire rural communities faced economic extinction. But Brazil struck back with characteristic determination. On March 28, a $2 billion trade agreement with Canada rerouted Brazilian agricultural exports northward. Beef flowed to Alberta and Manitoba, soybeans to Winnipeg and Saskatoon, ethanol to Quebec's refineries. The transformation was comprehensive. 150 ranches began exporting cattle to Toronto area slaughterhouses. 5,000 ranch jobs were preserved. Soy producers outside Londrina secured new credit lines to expand output, adding hundreds of thousands in revenue per farm. Canadian meat processing facilities added 400 workers to handle the increased volume. Grain cooperatives hired 250 additional employees. On May 10, trade ministers from both nations stood together, symbolizing Brazil's successful economic pivot. From German crankshafts destined for Ontario to Brazilian cattle trucked across the Canadian prairies. From Danish wind turbines arriving in Halifax to Korean lithium modules powering Toronto. This wasn't just a trade reshuffle. This was a complete reimagining of global economic relationships. The United States believed tariffs would bring manufacturing back home. Instead, they exported trust, partnerships, and economic opportunity. While Washington built walls, Ottawa offered bridges. While American plants went quiet, Canadian ports blazed with activity. While American suppliers scrambled to adapt, Canadian companies expanded shifts, hired rapidly, and forged new international alliances. This story isn't just about economics, it's about identity, trust, and what happens when the world's traditional leader decides to go it alone. 7 nations, representing trillions in economic activity, looked at America's ultimatum and found a better partner. The great irony is that America's attempt to strengthen its economic position may have accelerated its decline as the world's indispensable trading partner. Canada, long overshadowed by its southern neighbor, emerged as a beacon of economic cooperation and international partnership. The global economy has been fundamentally restructured in just 4 months. The question now isn't whether these changes are permanent, it's whether America can find its way back to the table it abandoned. What do you think? Did America's tariff strategy backfire as dramatically as these numbers suggest? Which country's pivot surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories reshaping our world.